In this video, we'll wrap this course up by learning how to get our textures out of Mari. Alright, great. So let's say we are completely done painting the textures for our ZBrush asset here inside of Mari. And now we're ready to get these textures out so they can be rendered in maybe another 3D application. Let's go ahead and walk through that process here. We have sort of a perfect scenario here with this particular project because we have both UV-based geometry in here as well as a Ptex object. So I can show you how to get both of those out. Let's go ahead and start with the body here. Remember, the body for our werewolf is actually a multi-tile layout, and this will be a really good example of a UV-based export. So the way we do this is we'll come over here to our channels palette, and notice here that we have 3 channels we've been working with. Now it's likely we won't need the ambient occlusion channel that we brought in, at least in terms of exporting that, because remember, we actually already have that in an image file format. So if we needed that, we already have it. So we'll just focus on exporting out some of these channels that we actually will need. So we have diffuse, we have roughness, and we have specular. And this process will be exactly the same for each of these 3. Let's go ahead and take our diffuse, for example, and we'll just right-click on that channel. And if we come down here, we have 2 different export options. We can either export this channel, or we can export this channel flattened. Now, more than likely, whatever application you're going into next with your textures really isn't going to have any use for your layered channel. So most of the time you're probably going to want to export your textures in a flattened format. Let's come down here and notice that the 3 options available to us here are exactly the same as under the export menu. Let's walk through these. So we can either export our current channel flattened, in this case the diffuse channel because that's the one we have selected. We can export all channels flattened for this particular object, which means the ambient occlusion channel as well. We don't necessarily need that. So now this last option is to export everything flattened. That's everything inside of our project. Now I'm going to go ahead and do this on an object by object basis because one, I don't want to walk through the process of exporting all my UV'd objects. I'm just going to illustrate this on the body. So let's just choose export current channel flattened. Alright, great. Now we're going to wait for Mari's dialog to open here, but again we're going to walk through this process for the body and then for the ground, because remember our ground is actually Ptex. Okay, great. We have here this export wolf body diffuse flattened dialog that came up, and we have a couple of different tabs here. So we could come in here and we could choose unique names for each one of the tiles that are currently laid out for this particular object. Remember, we have 3 different UDIMs or patches. We could do that here, but I don't typically do that. What I'll typically do is come over here and browse to where I want to save this. We'll just find my project files for this course. I'll go into other files and let's just say maps. I think that's where we had our ambient occlusions. Yeah. Actually, that was not them, but so let's go ahead and first start off by clearing out this template field. We did this earlier in this course, and that's going to show us the contents of this folder. So inside this folder, we have our ambient occlusion maps. Now, when we're exporting from Mari, that template is actually pretty important. That's how Mari knows how to name each particular image for each particular patch. So if we came over here and dropped this little menu down, you can see here we can bring that template back up. So we can come in here, and by default you should have something that looks like this. It basically says $channel $UDIM number .png. And that would work great for a Mari project that only had 1 object in it. So maybe you brought over 1 subtool. You could use this naming scheme. But remember, we have multiple objects here. So it might be nice to change this up a little bit. Let's come over here, and instead of using this, let's just mouse over this and look at all the different variables that we can input into our template. The one that I want to use is $entity. So if we start off with, say, $entity, and then do $channel, $UDIM, and then of course .file extension. By the way, these are all the file extensions right here that you can export your textures into. And when you're exporting things like a diffuse map, I would pretty much leave your color space set the way it's supposed to be. Because remember, we are exporting, in the case of our diffuse map, we're actually exporting an 8-bit image because that's the way that particular channel was set up. And exporting it with automatic sRGB means it's going to be encoded with the gamma for sRGB color space. And most rendering pipelines have a way of linearizing an sRGB image. If you've already worked out with maybe your rendering artist, whoever you're passing these textures off to, and maybe they just want linearized images from you, you could actually change that here. You could change this over to something like linear. And then that 2.2 gamma would not be baked into your textures. You'd still get 8-bit images, they just would not have the sRGB gamma. So again, I would recommend leaving this alone unless you have a specific reason to change that. Small textures is a good idea when you're working with multi-tile layouts. Sometimes a channel will not have much data for a particular patch, and Mari can save some space by outputting a very small image file in place of, say, a 2K or a 4K image for a patch that just really doesn't have any texture information on it. A good example of this would be the eyes on our werewolf. That particular texture is a solid color, and we don't really need to waste 2K or even 4K, whatever we set that up as, for that particular texture. We only need a few pixels to communicate a solid color. So I recommend leaving small textures turned on, and of course if we have alpha channels and you need that, you can always set that to keep. But I'm going to go ahead and leave that set to this right here, and actually what I may do inside of here is I may just make a new folder, and we'll say that call this something like wolf body. And jump inside that, and there we go. Let's go ahead and hit this export all patches button. Now, what you'll see here is the exporting layer was telling you what Mari's exporting. So wolf body, the diffuse channel, and it's not really concerned with the layer because we're flattening. So we'll go ahead and export all patches. And you'll see that Mari's going through the process of writing out 3 different flattened images, one for each of the patches, in this particular object. So let me go ahead and grab that for you and show you what we spit out. All right, here we are inside of my other files, and we'll just jump into this maps folder. We'll jump into wolf body, and there you go. You can see exactly what these textures look like. Let me go ahead and just make those a little bit bigger for you. There we go. And now you can see each of the 3 textures that we've spit out for this wolf geometry. And again, it follows the naming convention that we set with our template. We've got our object, the wolf underscore body object. We've got our channel, the diffuse, and then we've got the corresponding UDIM numbers for each of those 3 patches. There we go. 1001, 1002, and 1003. Great. Let me go ahead and just minimize this for the time being, and let's jump over here to our Ptex object, because this is going to look a little bit different for you. We'll go ahead and use the exact same workflow. We're going to, again, right-click on the, say, Ptex channel in this case. That's going to be my diffuse color. And we're going to go ahead and choose Export Flattened. And we'll say Export Current Channel Flattened. Again, we're not going to need any of the layered information. So this dialog, admittedly, will look a little different. So let me start off by just jumping over to my project files directory. There we go, other files, maps, and we'll just make a new folder here and call this ground. Now, I'm probably not going to include these exports with your project files, just so you know, just so we can avoid making the project files larger than they really need to be. So this dialog looks a little bit different, but really we're getting to the same end result. We're getting our texture out of Mari. So again, the most important thing here is to pay attention to your Ptex file template. With this one, you have a few less variables that you can use, but again, we used things like entity and channel previously. We just don't have UDIM available to us because, remember, with a Ptex object, we don't have a UV layout, so it really doesn't apply. So we could come in here and use the same first 2 variables. Maybe we come in and use entity, dot, let's see here, channel, something like that. And of course it's going to be named .ptex file because that's the file extension for Ptex. Now we have options down here for quad remapping and face bitmaps. We can include or turn that on or off. We have our Text Metadata, and this is something where I typically won't adjust these unless I have a reason to. We do have the ability to include geometry inside of our Ptex file. I don't like to do that because it makes the file very large, but we can include things like user attributes and adjacency information just with a relatively low overhead. And of course, we have our color space option here as well. So we've got our directory selected. Let's go ahead and export this out. And this may take Mari a moment to export, but once it has finished exporting out our Ptex file, I'll go ahead and show you the file that we have inside of the project files. All right, great. So our Ptex file has finished exporting, and I'm going to go ahead and bounce over here and show you what that looks like. So here inside of that ground folder, you can see my ground.ptex.ptx file, and you can see it is pretty good size. Now, fair warning, when you're working with Ptex with meshes of this size, it will take quite a bit of time for that Ptex file to export out of Mari. I can tell you that that Ptex file took between 30 and 45 minutes on my machine to get exported. So that is going to wrap up this course dedicated to getting you, the ZBrush artist, up to speed and ready to paint textures here inside of Mari. Thanks for joining us.